The confrontation at the fence. They thought I was just another quiet man living on a patch of land too large for one person to need. The HOA saw a fence, a few horses, and a name on a mailbox they didn't recognize, and decided I was expendable. They had no idea whose ground they were standing on. When the construction trucks rolled through the gate one gray morning, tearing across my pasture and sinking ruts into the soil, I stood there watching, hands in my pockets, heart steady, waiting. They said they had a permit. They said the pipeline would benefit the community. They never asked permission. The pipeline markers appear. 2 weeks later, the sprinklers in their manicured neighborhood sputtered and died. Lawns turned brown. Fountains stopped mid-flow because the pipeline they cut through my ranch had belonged to me all along, and the company that fed their water supply answered to my signature. That's when the real story began. I bought this land 10 years ago, 1,000 acres of rolling grass and red clay, tucked between two small Texas towns where the wind always smelled faintly of cedar and rain. It wasn't much when I found it. Broken fences, a collapsed barn, a house with windows missing and floors half rotted. But it was mine. And that mattered more than anything. I'd built my company from nothing. What started as a small family drilling business had grown into a regional water supplier. I worked my way through sleepless nights, busted pumps, and bad contracts until we were running half the county's wells. I didn't flaunt it. I preferred quiet, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've earned every acre under your boots. The land was my sanctuary. The mornings were for coffee on the porch, watching mist rise off the pond. Afternoons for tending cattle, checking pipelines, fixing whatever the last storm broke. Evenings for silence. Out here, silence had value. The HOA neighborhood sat a mile north, a gated development called Lakeside Preserve. All brick driveways, white fences, and identical smiles. I'd sold them water years ago, back when they first started building. They got it cheap because I believed in supporting local growth. They'd never given me trouble. Until they changed leadership. That's when he showed up, Dale Thompson, retired banker, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards. He'd bought a 2-story house by the lake and quickly decided he was mayor, sheriff, and judge rolled into one. The HOA loved him because he spoke with certainty, the kind that made weaker men nod instead of think. At first, it was small things, a letter about my fence line encroaching on HOA territory, a request to attend a meeting even though I wasn't under their jurisdiction. I ignored it. Then came the warnings about unregistered vehicles, my tractors, parked behind the barn. That's when I realized this wasn't confusion, it was intrusion. Still, I tried to be reasonable. The HOA boardroom meeting. I drove to their office one morning, papers in hand, and explained that my ranch wasn't part of their association. My property predated the development by decades. The county records were clear. The woman at the desk smiled, nodded, and said she'd make a note. A week later, surveyor flags appeared along my southern field, bright orange plastic dancing in the wind. I followed them and found they formed a perfect straight line, directly through my land. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then the heavy equipment arrived. The first bulldozer came just after sunrise. I could hear it long before I saw it, the growl of diesel echoing across the valley. When I reached the ridge, there they were. 3 construction vehicles, 6 workers in neon vests, and Dale standing proud with his clipboard, shouting instructions like a general on a battlefield. I walked down to meet them, boots sinking into churned mud. The foreman looked nervous when I asked who gave them permission. HOA directive, he said. We're expanding the community pipeline for irrigation. Shouldn't take long. I told him to shut the machines down immediately and that they were trespassing. He hesitated, glanced at Dale, and said quietly, "Talk to him." So I did. Dale smiled, that kind of smile people use when they think you're beneath them. He said, "Now listen, neighbor. We've got permits through the county. This line's for everyone's benefit. I'm sure you understand." I told him this was private property. He patted my shoulder like I was a stubborn child. "You'll thank us when you see the improvements." That's when I realized this wasn't ignorance. It was arrogance. I called the county office that afternoon. They confirmed no valid easement existed for the HOA's project. Their permit application was under review, which meant they were building illegally. I reported it. The county promised to investigate within 2 weeks. By the next morning, the trench was 100 feet longer. That's how it always starts. Not with explosions, but with small violations, each one disguised as progress. Each one betting that you're too tired to fight back. But I wasn't tired. Not yet. Late-night research. I started documenting everything. Drone footage, timestamps, written notices. I sent certified letters demanding they cease construction. Dale ignored them. He even mailed me a fine for interfering with authorized HOA development. The audacity almost made me laugh. When they hit my fence line, I stopped laughing. They cut through it with bolt cutters and left it hanging. My horses nearly escaped. That night, I stood at the edge of the trench under the floodlights, listening to the hum of generators and the scrape of steel on soil. And I made a decision. If they wanted a pipeline, they were going to learn what it meant to build one on the wrong man's land. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I stood there in the dark, watching the backhoe dip into my soil and spill it like a wound opening wider with every scoop. The sound carried across the hills. Heavy and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, steady, invasive. Wrong. I let them keep digging, because I wanted them to go deep enough that there'd be no denying what they'd done. The next morning, I called my legal team. I told them to prepare everything. Property maps, permits, contracts, even water supply agreements with the HOA. Then I called Jeff, my operations manager, and said 7 words he'd never heard me say before. Cut off Lakeside Preserve. Effective immediately. There was silence on the line. Then he said, "You sure?" "Completely," I replied. "Let them feel what they've taken for granted." The digging begins. Within 24 hours, every lawn in Lakeside Preserve began to fade. Sprinklers coughed and sputtered. Residents flooded their community group chat, confused and panicked. Someone posted a picture of their empty pool with the caption, "What's happening to the water?" Dale, of course, went into full command mode. He sent out an email blaming temporary maintenance issues and promised everything would be restored soon. He even tried to contact my company's customer support line. When they asked for the account holder's name, his voice turned sharp. He wasn't on the account. I was. By the 3rd day, tensions in the neighborhood boiled over. Residents marched into the HOA office demanding answers. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Some accused the board of corruption. Others threatened legal action. Dale tried to calm them with his usual smugness. But this time, nobody was listening. Meanwhile, I watched quietly from my ranch house a mile away, sipping coffee as a caravan of angry homeowners drove past my front gate. But the HOA still wasn't backing down. Dale called a private construction crew to continue digging despite the water crisis. He believed I'd cave first, that I couldn't afford to keep an entire neighborhood offline for long. He underestimated how long I could wait. When the crew returned, I confronted them again, this time with my attorney and a county officer. I presented every document, land titles, boundaries, pipeline rights. The officer turned to Dale and said, "You're operating outside your jurisdiction." Dale didn't even blink. He said, "We'll see what the courts say." They packed up for the day but left the trench open, a scar running across my pasture. That night, heavy rain came. The soil caved in, flooding the worksite. The trench collapsed, filling with muddy water that swallowed their equipment tires. Nature had sided with me. By morning, they were back with pumps and shovels. Dale stood ankle-deep in the mess, barking orders. I filmed everything. Then, an idea hit me, one that would change everything. If the HOA wanted to play this as a power game, I'd remind them who controlled the grid they lived on. Not through anger, but through precision. My company's supply network covered several residential zones, including Lakeside. Their water came from 2 primary wells, both under contracts with me that included a clause for termination due to unauthorized infrastructure interference. So, I exercised that clause legally. Within a week, I issued a formal termination notice. The HOA was now responsible for its own water supply. They couldn't switch providers. There wasn't another local supplier licensed within a 60-mile radius. The panic that followed was immediate. Emails, calls, threats, they all came pouring in. Dale tried to reach me personally, leaving voice messages dripping with fake politeness. "Let's discuss a reasonable compromise," he said. "We can resolve this without escalation." I didn't answer. I was done talking. 2 weeks later, the county sent investigators to assess the damage on my property. They measured the trench, photographed broken fences, documented illegal machinery use. The report confirmed everything. Full liability on the HOA. That's when the tide finally started to turn. The courtroom showdown. The homeowners, the same people who once ignored me, began showing up at my gate, apologizing for what their board had done. They were tired of the power games, tired of the arrogance. Their lawns were dead, their fountains cracked, and their bills skyrocketing because they had to truck in water. One woman, an older resident with silver hair and kind eyes, stood by my fence and said softly, "We didn't know what they were doing to you. We thought it was just business." We were wrong. Her words cut deeper than any of Dale's insults. Because she meant them, that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner who'd been bullied into silence by people hiding behind rules. As the weeks passed, the HOA started to crumble. Several board members resigned after discovering Dale had pushed the pipeline through without proper approval. Funds meant for maintenance were rerouted into his project expenses. The HOA bank account was nearly empty. When the county investigation became public, local news picked up the story. They ran headlines like "Ranch Owner Battles HOA Over Illegal Construction" and "Pipeline Power Struggle Drains Lakeside." Dale tried to spin it, claiming I was weaponizing water access for personal gain, so I released the contract. Every signature, every clause, every proof that the HOA had violated agreements and trespassed. The narrative flipped overnight. Public opinion turned against the HOA, and for the first time, I saw Dale sweat. Still, he refused to stop construction. He doubled down, filing a civil suit claiming I was interfering with public infrastructure. The county dismissed it immediately. That didn't stop him from appealing, but I had one last move left. When the pipeline team tried to reconnect to the main water line, my line, they hit a shutoff valve they didn't recognize. They called the county inspector to verify access. The inspector called me. Turns out they had accidentally dug into one of my private feeder systems that supplied Lakeside directly. In other words, they'd been trespassing not just on my land, but on my corporate infrastructure. That changed everything. The case moved from civil to criminal. Unauthorized interference with utility systems carried heavy penalties. Suddenly, Dale wasn't dealing with a rancher. He was dealing with a regulated utility company with full legal protection. The HOA's insurance refused to cover damages. The bank froze their account pending investigation. The community newsletter went dark. The proud, perfect Lakeside Preserve had become a ghost town of wilting lawns and furious homeowners. I hadn't lifted a hand against them. I'd simply enforced what was already mine, but the best was yet to come. The county court hearing was set for a Monday morning. I arrived early, calm and steady. Dale walked in wearing a suit too tight for his neck, his confidence cracking behind forced smiles. His lawyer tried to argue public benefit, but the judge wasn't buying it. Ethan reveals his power. When my attorney presented the evidence, the footage, the contracts, the recorded calls, the courtroom fell silent. You could almost hear the sound of realization settling in. Dale's smirk faded completely when the judge leaned forward and said, "Mr. Thompson, it appears you've not only trespassed, but abused your authority under false pretenses. This court finds you and the HOA liable for full damages, plus additional penalties." It was over. But I didn't smile. I just nodded once and walked out. Because justice isn't about celebration. It's about balance. And that balance had finally been restored. Dale's downfall. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. Reporters crowded the steps, shoving microphones forward, shouting questions. Mr. Carver, is it true the HOA owes you nearly $500,000 in damages? What do you plan to do with Lakeside Preserve now? I didn't answer. I just kept walking, because I knew the real victory wasn't the money. It was the silence that followed Dale out those doors. For years, men like him had bullied and manipulated under the guise of community standards. They'd fined single mothers for hanging wind chimes, threatened veterans over flagpoles, dictated how high someone's grass could grow, how long their truck could sit in a driveway. But today, they learned that power can't hide behind bylaws forever. Community reconciliation. 2 days after the verdict, I got a call from one of the remaining board members, Linda. She sounded exhausted. We voted to remove Dale as president. He's been asked to resign from the board entirely. I didn't gloat. I just said, good. Now maybe your neighborhood can breathe again. She hesitated, then added quietly, the residents want to apologize. They're organizing a meeting. They'd like you to attend. At first, I wasn't sure. After everything they'd done, the spying, the letters, the digging, part of me wanted to forget the place existed. But something about her tone felt honest. So, I agreed. That Saturday, I drove back to Lakeside Preserve for the first time in months. The roads I once avoided were lined with wilted hedges and cracked pavement. Lawns that used to look like magazine covers now lay brown and brittle. The HOA's precious order had dissolved. When I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, I expected hostility. Instead, I saw about 50 residents, parents, retirees, young couples, standing in a loose circle. When I stepped out of my truck, they clapped. I froze. A man stepped forward, one I recognized from the earlier disputes, a father of two who'd once yelled at me for blocking his view of the lake. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand. He said, "We all signed this. It's a petition to dissolve the HOA." My throat tightened. He handed me the paper. It was covered in signatures. Every single homeowner. Then he said something I'll never forget. We built this place thinking control meant safety. Turns out it just made us prisoners. You showed us that. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. All I could think about were those long nights, the trespassing, the fines, the isolation, the way they'd made me feel like a stranger on my own land. And now, standing there surrounded by those same people, I realized something powerful. Sometimes you win not by fighting harder, but by standing firm when everyone else bends. So, I thanked them, and before I left, I said, "If you rebuild, do it on respect, not rules." They nodded. Some even cried. Filling the trench. Later that week, I learned that Dale had left town. The county seized his personal property to cover the fines. Word spread quickly, not just across Lakeside, but through other communities, too. Within months, neighboring HOAs began auditing their own boards, checking for misuse of funds or overreach of authority. Local news stations dubbed it the Carver effect. I didn't ask for that name, but I understood why it stuck. Because every homeowner who'd ever felt powerless finally had proof that they could fight back and win. A few months passed. The trench across my land was filled and restored. Grass grew back over the scar, greener than before. Sometimes I'd stand by the water's edge, watching the ripples stretch across the lake. That lake used to connect my ranch and Lakeside Preserve. Now it felt like a bridge instead of a barrier. The barbecue gathering. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I heard laughter across the water. Kids playing near what used to be the HOA's private park. Their parents had opened it to everyone now. No badges, no permits, no restrictions. For the first time in years, it felt like a community, and that was worth more than any lawsuit. A few weeks later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address, just a clean white envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. "You were right. I thought rules made us civilized, but you showed me what real decency looks like. Dale." I sat there for a long time staring at that note. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was closure. Either way, I didn't need to reply, because in the end, we'd both learned the same lesson. Power doesn't come from authority. It comes from integrity. Months later, when the county held its annual property summit, they asked me to give a short talk about landowner relations. I almost declined. But then I realized something. This story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever stood their ground. So I went. I stood in front of a room full of officials, developers, and homeowners and said, "Land isn't about possession. It's about stewardship. If you treat it with respect, it'll take care of you. But if you use it to control others, it'll turn against you." When I finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. That night, I drove home under a sky filled with stars. The kind of stars you only see when you're far from the noise. As I turned down the long gravel road to my ranch, the porch light came into view, steady and warm. I thought back to the first time I'd stood there, angry and helpless watching strangers tear into my land. And I realized, if that never happened, I wouldn't be who I am now. Sometimes the worst battles bring out the best in us, and sometimes the biggest victories are the quiet ones, the peace that comes after the storm. Months rolled by. The county entered a new season, the kind where morning fog hangs low over the fields and everything smells faintly of rain. My ranch felt alive again. The grass, once shredded by heavy machinery, grew back lush and thick. Deer wandered through at dawn. Birds returned to the pines. The land was healing, and so was I. I didn't think much about the HOA anymore, but their shadow lingered, in the headlines, in the quiet conversations at feed stores and town diners. People stopped me sometimes, asking if the story was real. I'd nod and smile. "Yeah," I'd say. Every word of it. They'd shake their heads and laugh. "Guess you showed them." But the truth was, it wasn't about showing anyone. It was about reclaiming what should never have been taken, in dignity. One evening, I hosted a small barbecue by the lake. Former HOA residents came, the same ones who once avoided eye contact. There was no board now. No bylaws, no meetings, just neighbors. We grilled. We laughed. Kids ran barefoot in the grass. Someone brought fireworks. And when they cracked open the sky, their reflection danced across the water where the trench had once been. Standing there, I realized the pipeline, or that ugly scar they'd cut through my land, had accidentally united us. They meant to divide, but they built a bridge instead. The final reflection. I'd kept every letter, every notice, every photograph from that fight, stacked neatly in a folder labeled HOA Incident. One morning, I took that folder out to the fire pit. I fed each paper into the flames one by one. Not out of anger, but closure. The smoke drifted upward like a release. Years of frustration turning into nothing more than air. By the time the last page curled to ash, the sun had broken through the clouds, and I felt free. A few weeks later, I got a call from the county water board. They wanted to renew the supply contract, the same one that had caught the HOA by surprise. This time, though they wanted to name the new project after me, the Carver Line, I almost laughed. From a man nearly ruined by a pipeline, to having one carry his name. Funny how things come full circle. I agreed on one condition, that a portion of the profits go toward rural landowner education programs. No one should have to learn about property rights the hard way. Over time, word of the case spread far beyond our county. It became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes ordinary people can stand up to systems designed to break them. HOAs across the state quietly rewrote their bylaws, limiting their own power. For once, the change wasn't forced by fear. It was guided by awareness. Even Dale's note stayed pinned above my desk. It reminded me that villains in one chapter can still find redemption in another. He'd left town, but rumor had it he'd started working at a local nonprofit, helping veterans with housing disputes. Maybe the universe had a sense of irony, or maybe it just believed in second chances. Years later, I was interviewed on a podcast called Homefront Stories. The host asked, "If you could go back, would you handle it differently?" I thought for a long moment before answering. No, I said. Because sometimes the land teaches you through pain. You think you're protecting it, but it's really protecting you, showing you what kind of person you are when everything comfortable is stripped away. The host went quiet for a beat, then said softly, "That's powerful." I smiled. So is standing up for what's right. Today, when I walk along the pipeline path, it's barely visible. Nature has swallowed it. Grass grown over. Flowers blooming where concrete once split the soil. If you didn't know the story, you'd never guess what happened here. But I do, and I carry it with me. Not as bitterness, but as a badge of survival. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about land. It was about ownership of your rights, your voice, your self-respect. The HOA thought they could take that from me. But the thing about roots, they grow back stronger after the storm.